Hello, and good evening. I'm Nick Potter, Director of Community Relations and Development for the Pueblo City County Library District. Welcome to our virtual All Pueblo Reads author presentation, featuring Tim O'Brien, author of The Things They Carried. It is my pleasure to welcome you as we broadcast live from the Robert Hogue Rawlings Public Library and host you virtually this evening. We designed a virtual event that should be simple to access and easy to interact with. Here are a couple of notes so you can fully enjoy this virtual event. First, you can pause the live program at any point in the event. Just click the pause icon on the bottom left of your screen or by tapping your screen itself. If you pause the program, please be aware that you are delayed on the live video. You can also submit questions or comments to the author if you have a YouTube or Facebook account. If you have a YouTube or Facebook account, simply add a comment. And if you do not have a YouTube or Facebook account, you can enter your questions in on the webpage itself. This year's All Pueblo Reads was completely virtual and hosted more than 120 events. The Library District worked to develop an All Pueblo Reads that reflected our community needs currently and developed curriculum for online learning, virtual exhibits, and events for school-age children, and ensured that this literary event was not stopped by our current pandemic. The mission of All Pueblo Reads is to get everyone in Pueblo County reading and discussing one book at the same time. The 2020 selection is The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. Mr. O'Brien is joining us from his home in Austin, Texas this evening, so we can have a conversation about his award-winning novel. Each year, PCCLD, through the All Pueblo Reads project, features a piece of literature and brings an author to the community to promote dialogue across cultural, generational, and economic lines. This is the 16th year of All Pueblo Reads and reading together as a community. This year's event is part of a National Endowment for the Arts Big Read Grant. The selected book for 2020 is The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. We are pleased to virtually host Mr. O'Brien and look forward to hearing from him and receiving insights into his literature. Before Tim O'Brien was drafted into the Army, he had what some would consider an all-American childhood. He was born and raised in Minnesota. His mother was an elementary school teacher, his father an insurance salesman and sailor in World War II. O'Brien played Little League, dabbled in magic tricks, and spent much of his youth in the county library daydreaming about such characters as Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. In college, O'Brien received good grades and became student body president. Occasionally, he'd attend peace vigils and protests against the ongoing war in Vietnam. He graduated in 1968 with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and thought of becoming a writer. He once recalled in an interview that, quote, "Even getting on the plane for boot camp, I couldn't believe any of it was happening to me, someone who hated Boy Scouts and bugs and rifles." O'Brien spent his tour of duty in 1969 to 1970 as a foot soldier within the 5th Battalion, 46th Infantry in the Quang Ngai Province. For some of that time, he was stationed in My Lai, just 1 year after the infamous My Lai massacre. He was given a Purple Heart when he was hit with shrapnel in a grenade attack. His first published writing about his war experiences came in the form of a memoir called If I Die in a Combat Zone, Box Me Up and Ship Me Home, published in 1973 during his graduate studies in Harvard University. Soon after, he took a position for a year as a national affairs reporter for the Washington Post, then turned full-time to writing books. O'Brien published The Things They Carried in 1990. 2020 is the 30th year anniversary of the publishing of the book. His many accolades include a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Book Award, an award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and 2 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships. Mr. O'Brien, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This year, we have celebrated veterans, stories of valor, and the Vietnamese culture. I am so excited to hear from you and hear your insights on The Things They Carried and topics discussed in the book. Viewers of this program, please remember you can add questions in the dialog box below the video. Mr. O'Brien, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you for having me, and a big shout of thanks to Pueblo for selecting the things they carried for its citywide Big Read program. I'm really grateful. As I've mentioned 3 times now in my earlier internet presentations for Pueblo, a writer wishes above everything else to have people reading his work or her work, and it's therefore gratifying to know that my book has found so many readers in Pueblo. I do wish I could be there in person tonight. I'd been looking forward to seeing your part of Colorado and to meeting some of you. But alas, there's a pandemic and it was not meant to be. Speaking to you over the internet is far from ideal. For me, it's a little awkward, a little uncomfortable, mainly because I can't see any faces or see any reactions. In a way, as I stare now at my computer screen, it's a little like talking to a head of cabbage, which is so unlike my in-person experiences. On top of that, I'm a technological moron, which causes me to be nervous and a little frightened that I'll hit the wrong button and suddenly vanish. But I will do my best. It is impossible, obviously, to talk in detail about an entire book. So I'll begin tonight by concentrating on just one small chapter in the things they carried. First, I'll read this very short chapter aloud. It'll only take me a few minutes. And then I'll try to discuss what I hope to accomplish in the chapter, what I wanted you, the audience, the reader, to feel, and why the chapter is written the way it is. Again, this will be very short, but my hope is that by focusing on this little chapter, I'll also be saying something meaningful about the book as a whole. The chapter is called Spin. It's the 3rd chapter in the things they carried. The war was not all terror and violence. Sometimes things could almost get sweet. For instance, I remember a little boy with a plastic leg. I remember how he hopped over to Azar, a friend of mine, and asked for a chocolate bar. GI number 1, the kid said. And Azar laughed and handed over the chocolate. When the boy hopped away, Azar clucked his tongue and said, "War's a bitch." He shook his head sadly. One leg, for Christ's sake. One leg. Some poor fucker ran out of ammo. I remember Mitchell Sanders sitting quietly in the shade of an old banyan tree. He was using a thumbnail to peel off the body lice, working slowly, carefully depositing the lice in a blue USO envelope. After an hour or so, he sealed up the envelope, wrote "free" in the upper right-hand corner, and addressed it to his draft board in Ohio. On occasions, that war was like a ping pong ball. You could put fancy spin on it. You could make it dance. I remember Norman Bowker and Henry Dobbins playing checkers every evening before dark. It was a ritual for them. They'd dig a foxhole and get the board out and play long, silent games as the sky went from pink to purple. The rest of us would sometimes stop by to watch. There was something restful about it, something orderly and reassuring. There were red checkers and black checkers. The playing field was laid out in a strict grid. No tunnels or mountains or jungles. You knew where you stood. You knew the score. The pieces were out on the board. The enemy was visible. You could watch the tactics unfolding and the larger strategies. There was a winner and a loser. There were rules. I'm an old man now and a writer, and that war has been over for a long, long time. Much of it's hard to remember. I sit at this typewriter and stare through my words and watch my friend Kiowa sinking into the deep muck of a shit field, or Kurt Lemon hanging in pieces from a tree. And as I write about these things, the remembering is turned into a kind of rehappening. Kiowa yells at me. Kurt Lemon steps from the shade into bright sunlight, his face suddenly brown and shining, and then he soars into a tree. The bad stuff never stops happening. It lives in its own dimension, replaying itself over and over. Like when Ted Lavender went too heavy on the tranquilizers. How's the war today? Somebody would say. And Ted Lavender would give a soft, spacey smile at the sky and say, mellow, man. We got ourselves a nice mellow war today. And like the time we enlisted an old papasan to guide us through the minefields out on the Batangan Peninsula, the old man walked with a limp, slow and stooped over, but he knew where the safe spots were and where you had to be careful, and where even if you were careful, you could end up like popcorn. He had a tightrope walker's feel for the land beneath him, its surface tension, the give and take of things. Each morning we'd form up in a long column, the old papasan out front, and for the whole day we'd troop along after him, tracing his footsteps, playing an exact and ruthless game of follow the leader. My buddy Rat Kiley made up a rhyme that caught on, and we'd all be chanting it together. Step out of line, hit a mine. Follow the dink, you're in the pink. All around us, everywhere, the place was littered with bouncing betties and toe poppers and booby-trapped artillery rounds. But in those 5 days on the Batangan Peninsula, nobody got hurt. Nobody. And we all learned to love that old man. It was a sad scene when the choppers came to take us away. Lieutenant Jimmy Cross gave the old papasan a hug. Mitchell Sanders and Lee Strunk loaded him up with boxes of sea rations. There were actually tears in the old man's eyes. Follow Dink, he said to each of us. You go pink. In Vietnam, if you weren't humping, you were waiting. And more than anything, what I now remember is the monotony. Digging foxholes, slapping mosquitoes, the sun and the heat and the endless paddies. Even in the deep bush where you could die any number of ways, the war was nakedly and aggressively boring. But it was a strange boredom. It was boredom with a twist, the kind of boredom that causes stomach disorders. You'd be sitting at the top of a high hill, the flat paddies stretching out below, and the day would be calm and hot and utterly vacant. And you'd feel the boredom dripping inside you like a leaky faucet. Except it wasn't water. It was a kind of acid. And with each little droplet, you'd feel the stuff eating away at important organs. You'd try to relax. You'd uncurl your fists and let your thoughts go. Well, you'd think, this isn't so bad. And right then, you'd hear gunfire behind you, and your nuts would fly up into your throat, and you'd be squealing pig squeals. That kind of boredom. I feel guilty sometimes. An old man now, and I'm still writing war stories. My daughter, Kathleen, tells me it's an obsession, that I should write about a little girl who finds $1 million and spends it all on a Shetland pony. In a way, I guess she's right. I should forget it. But the thing about remembering is that you don't forget. You take your material where you find it, which is in your life, at the intersection of past and present. The memory traffic feeds into a rotary up in your head, where it goes in circles for a while. And then pretty soon imagination flows in, and the traffic merges and shoots off down 1,000 different streets. And as a writer, all you can do is pick a street and go for the ride, putting things down as they come on at you. That's the real obsession, not Vietnam, not the war, but instead all those stories. Not bloody stories necessarily, happy stories too, and even a few peace stories. Here's a quick peace story. A guy goes AWOL, shacks up in Da Nang with a Red Cross nurse. It's a great time. The nurse loves him to death. The guy gets whatever he wants whenever he wants it. The war is over, he thinks. Just nookie and new angles. But then, one day, he rejoins his unit in the bush. Can't wait to get back into combat. Finally, one of his buddies asks, what happened with the nurse? Why so hot for combat? And the guy says, all that peace, man. All that peace. It felt so good it hurt. I want to hurt it back. I remember Mitchell Sanders smiling as he told me that story. Most of it he made up, I'm sure. But even so, it gave me a quick little truth goose. Because you see, it's all relative. You're pinned down in some filthy hellhole of a rice paddy, getting your ass delivered to kingdom come. But then for a few seconds, everything goes quiet, and you look up and see the sun and a few puffy white clouds, and the immense serenity flashes against your eyeballs. The whole world gets rearranged. And even though you're pinned down by a war, you never felt more at peace. What sticks to my memory often are those odd little fragments that have no beginning and no end. Norman Bowker lying on his back one night, watching the stars, then whispering to me, I'll tell you something, O'Brien. If I could have one wish, anything, one wish, I'd wish for my dad to write me a letter and say it's okay if I don't win any medals. That's all my old man talks about, nothing else. How he can't wait to see my goddamn medals. Or my buddy Kiowa, teaching a rain dance to Rat Kiley and Dave Jensen. The three of them whooping and leaping around barefoot while a bunch of villagers looked on with a mixture of fascination and giggly horror. Afterward, Rat said, so where's the rain? And Kiowa said, "The earth is slow, but the buffalo is patient." And Rat thought about it and said, "Yeah, but where's the rain?" Or Ted Lavender adopting an orphan puppy, feeding the puppy from a plastic spoon and carrying it in his rucksack until the day Azar strapped the puppy to a Claymore anti-personnel mine and squeezed the firing device. The average age in my platoon, I'd guess, was 19 or 20. And as a consequence, things often took on a curiously playful atmosphere, like a sporting event at some exotic reform school. The competition could be lethal, and yet there was a childlike exuberance to it all. Lots of pranks, lots of horseplay. Like when Azar blew away Ted Lavender's puppy. "What's everybody so upset about?" Azar said. "I mean, Christ, look at me. I'm just a boy." I remember these things too, and I'll just list them for you. The damp, fungal scent of an empty body bag. A quarter moon rising over the nighttime paddies. Henry Dobbins sitting in the twilight, sewing on his new buck sergeant stripes, quietly singing a tisket, a tasket, a green and yellow basket. A field of elephant grass, weighted with wind, bowing under the stir of a helicopter's blades, the grass dark and servile, bending low, but then rising straight again when the chopper went away. A red clay trail outside the village of Mike. A hand grenade. My hand on the hand grenade. A slim, dead, dainty young man of about 20. Kaya was saying, "No choice, Tim. What else could you do?" Kaya was saying, "Right?" Kaya was saying, "Talk to me." An old man now, and the war occurred more than half a lifetime ago. And yet the remembering makes it now. And sometimes remembering will lead to a story, which makes it forever. That's what stories are for. Stories are for joining the past to the future. Stories are for those late nights in the night, those late hours in the night, when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. Stories are for eternity, when memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story. Well, why do I choose this chapter to talk about this evening? Well, there are a bunch of reasons, and I'm going to go through them as briefly as I can with you. The first reason is the absolute absence of chronology. Essentially, this chapter is a group of very, very, very short stories, most of them just a couple of inches long, a paragraph or two. Little bitty stories, but without any transitions and without any sense of linearity that most novels and stories have, where events go in a linear line. There's none of that. No transitions, no chronology, and no linearity. And for me, this is how my memory works. The book's main character, remember, who has my name, Tim O'Brien, is looking back on his time in Vietnam after many, many, many years later, trying to recollect it and also trying to make meaning out of it. And yet the war is scrambled in his memory, just as it is in my memory. Often I can't remember what happened first, second, third, fourth, or even events can be separated by months, and I can't remember which thing happened first. And I think this is true for most of us. If I were to ask any of you to tell me what happened to you yesterday, and if I were to ask you to put yesterday's events in order, I doubt that you'd have very much success. And what about 2 weeks ago? Or what about 2 years ago? Or in my case, what about 50 years ago? So I wanted in this chapter and in the book as a whole to pretty much dispense with the idea of chronology, because what happens is that incidents and events will stick to your memory, but you can't remember what preceded it or what followed it. And I wanted to give that sense of a scrambled memory of pretty traumatic events. But on top of the problem of memory, the war itself was chaotic. One firefight would bleed into the next firefight, and then the next one, and the next one, and then the next one. One mortar attack would blend in with all the other mortar attacks. And you're left not with a sense of a linear experience during a war, but you're left instead with these little clumps of memory that aren't attached to much else. They live in their own world, little clumps of experience. And then the next one, which might have happened a month earlier or a month later. On top of the chaos of war, though, there is a third problem, which is almost exactly the reverse of chaos. It was the sameness of the days and of the nights. They all seemed alike. The monotony by daylight of marching from village to village, wading through rice paddies, wading across rivers. And you do it day after day after day after day for 360 days. And then at night, the monotony of staring into the dark as you lie in ambush, or as you sit at your foxhole at 3 a.m. This sense of each day and each night being exactly like all the other days and all the other nights makes it really hard, in my case, impossible, to string the beads of memory on a chronological thread. I just can't do it. Another thing to mention about the chapter I read to you is the blur between fiction and fact, reality and invention or make-believe. For me, this is not a device. This is the reality of my own personal life. People often ask, readers often ask me, what really happened? What's the truth? Why do you write fiction in the first place? The truth is that late at night, it is extremely hard for me to believe that what happened actually happened. Did I really get wounded by a hand grenade? Intellectually, I know I did, but it feels and seems completely impossible that a guy like the guy you're looking at right now was actually in a war. That seems impossible. Oftentimes, while I was in the war, I would look down at my hands, which would be gripping an M16 rifle, and I think, are these my hands? Am I really in a war? Your brain knows you are, but it feels so bizarre and so outlandish and so impossible that part of your sensibility keeps questioning the reality that you're immersed in. On top of that, another reason that I began with this chapter tonight is that a professor of English who went to West Point, served in the Gulf War, and is now a professor of English, is at work on a biography of me. And I'm learning from him every day how little I remember, and how what I do remember can't be put in any chronological order or any linear order. I'm a novelist, and in most novels, there is a sense of linearity and a sense of progression and a sense of chronology. But in a way, that seems to me to be a lie that is artificially imposed on human memory, especially in the case of trauma, which Vietnam certainly was for all of us who took part in the actual combat, where linearity is a lie. Nothing feels linear. So this chapter's spin, I hope, reflects the structure of the entire book called The Things They Carried. It is an episodic book. There are few transitions, and there's very little linearity. In a way, writing The Things They Carried was the opposite of writing an ordinary novel, where one event will cause the next, which will cause the next, and you'll get a beginning, a middle, and an end. In Vietnam, everything spins. The beginning spins to the end, and the end spins back to the beginning. And in my dark nights at night, at 3 a.m, that's what always happens to me. I'm spinning in memory. I want to switch to another topic before I stop and ask for whatever questions you might have or comments. I wrote a new book that came out almost exactly a year ago. The paperback has just come out. And in this book, there's a chapter called War Buddies. And I wanted to say a little bit, because this is my final event in Pueblo. I'll be finished in a half an hour. I wanted to say some emotional things, to me are emotional, that may impact some of you out in the audience, especially if you happen to be a veteran, or if you're married to a veteran, or your boyfriend is a veteran, or your girlfriend is a veteran. Not all soldiers and not all veterans are alike. They're not homogeneous. We're all a mixed bag, just as humanity is. We get the impression sometimes that all veterans somehow are identical. One thinks what the other one thinks, and one behaves as the other one behaves. This is not true, obviously. And The Things They Carried, the characters of Azar and Rat Kiley have some pretty conspicuous moral flaws. They can be despicable. Yet, both characters also have redeeming qualities and do beautiful and good things. The same is true with every character in the book: Jimmy Cross, Kurt Lemon, Kiowa, and most especially the Tim O'Brien character. Good things and bad things. In a sense, these fictional characters have now become my best friends. They are as real to me as anybody who's not present in a room, real people. But these characters aren't present in the room, and they're equally real to me. At night sometimes, I'll think about Azar, or Rat Kiley, or Kiowa, or Jimmy Cross, as if I were thinking about childhood friends I knew many, many years ago. So for a few minutes, I want to talk about the real human beings upon which some of these characters were based, my old war buddies. For all the differences between us, and there were plenty of them, I can't help but feel the almost instantaneous urge to cry when I encounter my old war buddies. An email will do it to me. I'll choke up at old photographs. On several occasions, maybe a dozen or so times over the years, former members of Alpha Company have shown up when I speak at colleges or in cities around the country. And when I see their time-worn faces in the audience, the urge to sob stops being just an urge, and it becomes a fast heartbeat and stinging eyes and a voice that cracks and won't behave itself. This is love, I guess. More than that, I admire so much about these old buddies of mine. Half a century ago, amid all that horror, their courage and comportment had seemed to me close to miraculous. They stood up under fire. They made their legs move. They did what they believed to be necessary and even virtuous. They searched tunnels, walked point, gave aid to one another, and obeyed even the silliest and most lethal commands. Nobody faked illness. No one refused to advance under fire. Also, what made them special, at least to me, was how relentlessly ordinary they were. So matter of fact, so impassive, so young, so unexceptional as they endured things that seemed beyond enduring. In a way, my war buddies are like a mirrored reflection of all the anonymous grunts populating the age-old record of man killing man, including a reflection of the enemy we had once faced, an enemy who also made their legs move, who did what they believed to be necessary and virtuous, who also obeyed the silliest and most lethal commands, and who also endured the unendurable. The enemy, too. They, too, are my war buddies. The VC, the NVA. They're my war buddies as much as the guy who fixes my bathtub when it leaks or mows my lawn. I feel much more in common with the former enemy than I do with most of the people who surround me in my civilian life. After my buddies and I shake hands and say goodbye at the end of our occasional meetings together, returning to our decaying lives, there's always a melancholy that stays with me for a day or two, sometimes even a month or two. That melancholy reaches back into history. I'll think about my buddies, Cop and Kid and Buddy Wolf and Buddy Barney and all the others. And then I'll think about Shakespeare's band of brothers, we happy few. I'll find myself deleting the word happy. I'll wonder how happy the dead were to become the dead, or how happy the legless were to become the legless. And although Shakespeare's music stirs the brotherhood inside me, it's also true that the toneless dead must be included among my war buddies. To them, as much as to the living, I am allegiant. I love these men, enemy or otherwise. And I love them throughout history for all they endured, for the courage they showed, and for their unexceptional ordinariness. Just human beings. That's the conclusion of my little presentation about the things they carried. And now it would be nice to respond to whatever questions you might have.
Mr. O'Brien, I know I said this yesterday, but thank you for your presentation. I just think you're such an endearing and impactful speaker. And I think that you give us greater appreciation to a war that's so far removed in terms of time.
Thank you.
So thank you for being here. And, you know, I think I'd also be remiss to say that we would love to have had you here in person, but I think that your impact that you've been able to have here in a virtual format is just as impactful. And I think that I really want to thank you for your strength and willingness to do this virtual format. And I think that I also would like to say thank you for allowing us this time to be able to present to our community. And I think that that's reflective in one of our first questions. And I think that this viewer asked this question because they would like to hear your insights on how to deal with our current climate. And so the first question is, from your perspective, how is the Vietnam era similar or dissimilar to our current era?
In a lot of ways, it feels like a repetition of the time that I lived through back in the 1960s and early 1970s. America was divided over the war in Vietnam. Hawks were at the throats of doves. People were out in the streets in great masses protesting. Families were divided, including my own family. My mom was for the war. My dad was against it. Congress was divided. There were those who wanted to bomb Hanoi, and there were those who wanted to get the hell out of Vietnam. Well, everything I'm saying is pretty much an echo of the divisions this country is going through at this instant as the votes are being tabulated. And we see an almost 50-50 split in America today that is so reminiscent of the era in which the Vietnam War was fought. I can't imagine a more eerie and almost bizarre similarity. On top of that, America in its own way is at war right now with a pandemic. And unlike Vietnam, where only 500,000 of us were in the war fighting at any one time, in America, everybody, 370 million of us are involved in a war on a daily basis. Oh, I forgot my mask. I got to drive 3 miles back home and get it. Or I better not go to that party I said I'd go to tonight. It's too dangerous. And I might hurt other people and make them sick. So we're all involved in a war now. It's a war of a different sort, but it's like a war in the sense that it's life and death for so many of us. The divisions are amazing in this country. They're sad, just as they were sad back then. They're infuriating, as they were back then. People are angry. All you have to go is on social media, in very much the same way they were angry back then. No social media, no internet back then, but the anger was certainly there, and it was there just with the same kind of volatile, explosive danger feeling to it that there is today. I worried about my country back in the late 60s and early 70s because of these divisions and anger, the inability of people to be even civil to one another. And I'm worried about my country again today. So it's a great question to ask. And I wish my answer were more optimistic, but right now I feel sad for my country.
Thank you for that. We have another question, and I'm actually going to weave two questions together because I know that you wrote a 20th anniversary article, I think, for the New York Times, and I think that it actually kind of reflects both of these questions. And the question actually asks, if you've been back to the Vietnam War or to the Vietnam country, what were your feelings about the time that you were there and kind of reflecting back to your time into the war? But then our viewer also asked that I'm going to kind of ask you to weave these together because I think that they work really well. Was it difficult for you to go back to Vietnam with your daughter?
Well, I'll take the last part first. I don't have a daughter. And when that book was written, I didn't have any kids at all. Now I do. The book is fiction. It says so right on the title page, a work of fiction. On the other hand, I wanted to write a book in which people would forget that it's fiction. So I'm happy that people think I have a daughter. It means I succeeded as a writer in making things seem real that were invented. I did go back, though, with someone who could have been my daughter. My girlfriend at the time was, I think, 18 years younger than I. She made me go back to Vietnam. The New York Times invited me to go back and to write an article for them. I said no, not because of psychological reasons, but mainly because I hate airplanes and I get restless sitting for 20 hours in an airplane seat. I'm a smoker, and you can't smoke on airplanes. Even back then, it was in '94, it was frowned on. So it was the discomfort that made me not want to go. But my girlfriend wanted to know why I would wake up yelling in my sleep sometimes, and why I would go silent for periods, kind of staring into space as I remembered something about the war. And so I went for her. She came with me. It was an amazing experience to go back to Vietnam. I found places, earlier I'd spoken tonight when I was talking about how unreal the war felt to me, even at the time, and how more unreal it became after I was home. How could that have even happened? Did it happen? So I revisited physical spots on the earth in Vietnam where things had happened, where people had died or been wounded, where I'd been wounded. I found villages that were terrifying places where every time we'd enter it, someone would get hurt or die. And what I discovered was that Vietnam was not just a war, but it was a place on the earth, and a gorgeous, beautiful place that I didn't even see during my time in Vietnam. I was blind to it. I'd see the mountains, but I wouldn't see mountains. I would see danger. I'd see the prospect of dying when I'd look up at those mountains, thinking I've got to go into them and do terrible things and maybe die. So I didn't see the beauty of those mountains. Instead, I saw just danger. And that was true of most of Vietnam for me. The villages looked dangerous. The red clay soil beneath which landmines were lying felt dangerous. Just the earth itself. The rice paddies felt dangerous. The whole place felt like it was a creature out to kill me and all my friends. But on my return to Vietnam, I saw the beauty. I found the rice paddy in which I was wounded. And it was like revisiting a sandbox back in your childhood, a place that you're not quite sure really existed, but does exist. A little boy sitting on a water buffalo waving at me from across the paddy. Another little boy, maybe 8 years old, coming up to sell me a Coke. I saw the beauty, not just the physical beauty in Vietnam, which was enormous, but I also saw the beauty inside the Vietnamese people. So incredibly forgiving. 3 million Vietnamese died in that war. That's a lot of dead people. And they had mothers and fathers just like we do. And they had brothers and sisters just like we do. And I'm not sure that people in Des Moines or Sioux City or wherever in this country would be as forgiving as the Vietnamese were to me. And I was the enemy to them all those years ago. It was a beautiful experience. It didn't have a happy ending, unfortunately. My girlfriend and I broke up almost immediately upon returning from Vietnam, which was devastating. And that became part of the article that I wrote for the New York Times. It was more about a breakup than it was at least as much about a breakup as it was about revisiting Vietnam. And how the end of love shares with the combat experience a lot of stuff that seemed to me they were totally dissimilar. You'd wake up at 2 in the morning and look at your watch and wait an hour and then it'd be 2:01. You wait another hour and it'd be 2:02. That kind of way time just slows down at the end of a relationship. And in Vietnam too, late at night on guard. In so many different ways, loneliness and where did God go and why have I been deserted? And will I ever be happy again? Those things and many more were very similar to my experience in Vietnam.
And our next question, I think, really speaks to our community's interest and respect into your intelligence, your insight, and also I think it speaks to our current climate and wanting some guidance. And I don't just say this because the woman asking it was my high school criminology teacher. But I say this because I know her, and she means this in a very, very sincere way. But this is a follow up to your first question. And she asks, if this era is similar to the Vietnam era, what advice would you give to this current generation to maybe help alleviate the division?
Well, I was asked the same question in Pueblo last night, and I forthrightly admitted I don't know. I'm as confused as anybody else about the incredible divisions in this country. I'm dismayed by bullyism and narcissism, self-congratulation, deceit on all sides. All I could say last night is all I can say tonight, is we got to be nice to each other. Got to be decent to our neighbors and our friends. In Vietnam, we called it, you got to keep humping. You just keep moving your legs. Even if every corpuscle in your body says fall and quit and give up. But in America, we can't quit and give up. We've got to keep humping. In a way, the election, which is still going on, and the votes are tabulated, at least when I started this conversation, they were maybe it's over now for all we know. But there was a bright side of the last week or so. And the bright side is how people didn't give up. They voted in huge record numbers. That is the bright side of one thing that Trump's people and Biden's people have in common is they voted. They do have that in common. and they voted in huge numbers. They troubled to fill out ballots, troubled in some cases to go to polls in the pandemic. Well, that's something that is shared on these two competing factions in our country. And for me, I've got to find grace somewhere. And I find it in that. Let's be nice to one another. Look at what we do share.
On that, I'm actually, I'm going to be selfish and I'm going to ask a question from my perspective. And in this last month, as part of All Pueblo Reads, we've really focused on veterans, stories of valor, and also the Vietnamese culture. And in doing that, we have come across some just amazing people who were part of the Vietnam War as either soldiers or medics or nurses. And one of the things that we did that I think was the most rewarding was that we did a food drive for veterans where we provided 800 bags of food for veterans in the southeastern Colorado community. And so for me, that really showed a huge need in our community in terms of food insecurity with our veterans. And so with that, I would just like to ask, from your perspective, what do veterans need so that they can survive and hopefully thrive outside of their time of service?
They need the ears of the people around them to listen, to be open. They need sometimes to be asked questions. Veterans are not going to begin saying, oh my God, I got to tell you about Vietnam. They just don't do it. Who would? It's not polite. And so they stay silent. It's not as if they don't want to talk, but often, maybe most often, questions have to be asked. You were a veteran. Where were you? What did you do? What was your job? Not everybody in Vietnam was a combat person. Only 1 in 12, like me, were combat people. The rest were truck drivers and typists and did all kinds of stuff. But to ask questions is to elicit a little story. And the telling of stories can be a 2-minute long story, a little memory that veteran might say in response to your question can lighten the burden for that veteran. He's got it out of his mouth. And by getting it out of your mouth, you've gotten it a little bit, at least, out of your gut and out of your heart where it hurts. It's kind of like what I said in response to the earlier question. Be nice to one another. Be nice to veterans. Don't be afraid to ask questions. If they don't want to talk, they won't. If they do want to, they may. But I don't talk about Vietnam unless somebody asks me about it. I only do it in occasions like this, when I have to. When I'm on a screen and I got to say something or else the hour will be pretty quiet. So I talk. But outside of this sort of thing, I don't talk about Vietnam in my house or with friends unless a question is asked. And then I do a little. And I think that's the best we can do. Be nice. Don't be afraid to ask a question or two, which is a kind of politeness, in my opinion.
And Mr. O'Brien, again, as we conclude this evening, from the community of Pueblo, I really want to thank you. We've really enjoyed reading your literature, and we've enjoyed your time throughout this month.
I hope I get to come someday. Thank you all.
Thank you again. And as a viewer, please know that you can go to the Pueblo Library's All Pueblo Reads page, which is www.pueblolibrary.org/allpuebloreads to see all of our programs that we had as All Pueblo Reads, as well as other selections from Mr. O'Brien. Thank you for taking part in this presentation. I hope that you've enjoyed the 2020 All Pueblo Reads. Thank you, and have a great evening.